Welcome to Indus Special. I'm Ejaz Haider. Last Friday, US President Donald Trump tweeted that he had called off a military strike on Iran. Tensions between the United States and Iran have been steadily building since May 2018, when the Trump administration unilaterally withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal despite objections from members of his cabinet, including then Secretary of Defense James Mattis and the US's European allies. The other signatories to the deal, France, the UK, Germany, Russia, China, and Iran, all said they would continue to honor the agreement despite the US's withdrawal. So here's the timeline of sorts of how this began. So May 8th, there's the unilateral withdrawal. Then on May 21st, 2018, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo laid out the Trump administration's 12 demands for a new agreement with Iran, which underscored the policy objectives of the campaign of maximum pressure. Pompeo called on Iran to give a full accounting of its nuclear program and to withdraw support for proxy groups in the region, among several other ultimatums. On 7th August 2018, the Trump administration reimposed the first round of sanctions on Iran, originally lifted as part of the nuclear deal. They target Iran's finances with the goal of squeezing the economy. On 5th November 2018, the maximum pressure campaign on Iran intensified with a new round of sanctions targeting Iran's economy, specifically its oil and banking sectors. On 8th April 2019, the United States designated Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps a terrorist organization, the first time it's ever made such a classification for an arm of a foreign government. Iran retaliated by designating the US military a terrorist group. On 2nd May 2019, the administration ended waivers that allowed countries to import Iranian oil. Without those waivers, countries that purchased oil from Iran, including China, India, and Japan, could also be subject to US sanctions. If those countries chose to stop buying Iranian oil, it would hurt Iran's economy even further. On 5th May 2019, US National Security Advisor John Bolton announced that in response to a number of troubling and escalatory indications and warnings, the US would send an aircraft carrier and bomber planes to the Persian Gulf. He said that the US was not seeking a war with Iran, but that it was fully prepared to respond to any attack, whether by proxy, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or regular Iranian forces. On 8th May 2019, the Trump administration imposed additional sanctions on Iran, targeting its steel, aluminum, and copper industries. Iran signaled that it would back away from some elements of the nuclear deal. Iranian President Hassan Rouhani said Iran would start stockpiling low-enriched uranium and heavy water, exceeding the limits of the nuclear deal. Rouhani also gave the other signatories to the deal 60 days to help curtail the US sanctions and ease the economic pressure. Otherwise, it would begin to enrich uranium beyond the threshold set in the nuclear deal, becoming a little closer to getting a nuclear bomb. On 13th May 2019, 4 oil tankers were attacked in the Strait of Hormuz, a vital waterway for the oil trade. Bolton said Iran was likely behind the attacks, a charge denied by Iran. On 24th May 2019, the Trump administration decided to send an additional 1,500 troops and other defense capabilities to the Middle East to counter Iran. On 13th June 2019, 2 oil tankers were attacked in the Gulf of Oman. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo blamed Iran, and US officials released a video they claimed showed Iran's involvement. Iran denied the charge again. On 17th June 2019, Iran said it was just 10 days from surpassing the limits set by the nuclear deal on its stockpile of low-enriched uranium. This was intended to pressure the Europeans to give Iran economic relief from sanctions. Tehran said if the Europeans stepped up, it would go back to following the terms of the deal. That same day, the US announced it is sending another 1,000 troops to the Middle East, and yet another signal to Iran. Bolton said the deployment was intended to send a clear and unmistakable message to the Iranian regime that any attack on United States interests or on those of our allies will be met with unrelenting force. 20th June 2019, Iran shot down a US military drone. The US confirmed the downing but said the drone was flying over international waters. Iran released coordinates to show the drone was in Iranian airspace. On 21st June 2019, Trump tweeted that he called off a strike against Iran the night before, which had been intended to retaliate against Iran for the downed drone. Trump said he did so 10 minutes before the planned attack because of potential casualties, saying it was not proportionate to shooting down an unmanned drone. To discuss the ongoing situation and war of words and actions, we are joined by Dr. Behrad Nakhai. He joins us from Washington, D.C., and also by Dr. Herbert Reginbogin, who's a fellow at the Institute of Policy Research at the Catholic University of America and co-chair New Security Architecture. Dr. Nakhai, give me a sense of what is happening, because on the one hand, President Trump has been saying that he wants to get the U.S. out of unwanted, expensive, costly wars. That includes withdrawal from Syria and talks with the Taliban in Afghanistan. And yet, there was the unilateral withdrawal from the JCPOA, and as I said, recounted the timeline, the pressure has been ratcheted up, and there's always a scope for miscalculation here. So what's going on?
Thank you for having me. Let's look at a couple of items. Number one, JCPOA is the result of the United Nations Security Council resolution that was signed on by the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, plus Germany, plus Iran. It's not a bilateral agreement. It's an international agreement that all members must, according to the United Nations Charter, obey the resolution and abide by its term. So Iran, under that resolution, accepted JCPOA and accepted a set of voluntary measures, not imposed on Iran, but voluntary measures. Since JCPOA was signed in 2015, Iran has been meticulously and affirmed by IAEA, the sole agency that has been put in charge of monitoring and studying and reporting on Iran's nuclear activity. Iran has been faithful to its obligations as described under JCPOA. The other 5 members, plus Germany, all in one way or the other have reneged under their commitments and have not performed. Of course, all of them have provided the lip service, but none of them have done their duties, and the United States has completely abrogated its responsibility to its signature. It was not a signature by the president, it's the signature by United States America. In other words, the other people who signed it were signing on the credit of the United States of America. So Iran said that none of these countries have paid their dues under these and have met their obligations. So Iran is going to go beyond of some of those self-imposed voluntary limits that it has put in. Even if Iran goes to what it said will do, it does not reach the limit of JCPOA or breach those limits. So Iran said they will do that, and all of a sudden, everybody started to call this blackmail or calling it, you shouldn't do it. Even the United States that pulled out of these agreements said Iran must stay and abide by its agreements. It's very hard, the agreement that they don't accept it, why they expect Iran to abide by it.
Okay.
Finally, I think yesterday it came that they said that the Europeans are going to meet today and provide the incentive that they were supposed to provide.
Absolutely. Thank you for giving us this overview, Dr. Nakhai. Let me go to Dr. Reginbogin. Dr. Reginbogin, Dr. Nakhai is obviously focusing on JCPOA because that was the multilateral agreement, and IAEA is also very clear, so are the inspectors, that Iran has abided by the provisions of that agreement. However, as I said in my introduction, Trump administration has been looking at Iran in not just vis-a-vis the JCPOA, although Trump, even during his campaign, had said that this is a bad agreement. But there are the other 12 demands, including, Iranian power projection and realpolitik, and the fact that Iran has been using proxies in Syria and the rest of it. So it's not just about the JCPOA. But this rhetoric that has been ratcheted up, of course, primary and secondary sanctions, has now led us to a situation where Iran is obviously retaliating. And as I said earlier to Dr. Nakhai, there's scope for miscalculation. How do you make sense of this situation?
The security architecture, which has never really developed in terms of the JCPOA. It's very singular in terms of what it addresses. The cumulative issues, as you've already pointed out, is proxies, as well as missile development. And the target is Israel. And the destabilization on the Arabic Peninsula, in which the Iranians attempt to find a corridor to the Eastern Mediterranean, is a geostrategic challenge to the entire region as well as internationally. This is the crisis what is now facing the West and Iran. It is the crisis of the JCPO because it lacked the instruments to include these two very important issues. This is why it's called a failed agreement. The bellicosity, the rhetoric, is really the very, very verge of war. And this is, of course, the reason that we are discussing this today, is how to create a security architecture to negotiate something whereby both and all parties will find that they are not threatened.
Okay, so let me try and understand this. You think that Trump administration's focus away from JCPOA, not just JCPOA, is justified because of Iranian use of proxies in the Middle East and the Middle Eastern conflicts, and also Iran's missile development. If I have understood that correctly, I would like you to tell me that instead of unilaterally withdrawing from JCPOA, would it not have been better for the United States and the European allies, in combination with the European allies, to have engaged Iran separately on the other issues of concern?
Naturally, that would have been an option, but it hasn't been chosen. And the reason for its not being chosen is because the United States administration perceives Iran as not being a reliable partner in terms of what it does on the ground. In this one instance, the Iranians are meeting the terms and conditions of the JCPOA agreement. At the same time, it is very much spreading what is considered state terrorism in the region and in other regions. And it is also developing missiles which have made in Iran when they are reaching Israel. So
Dr. Reginbogin, let me interject here. When you say that Iran is not a reliable partner, and when we also see that as far as the JCPOA's provisions were concerned, Iran has abided by them, the IAEA certification is there, so Iran has held its part of the bargain in a multilateral agreement, whereas what we see empirically is that the US, by unilaterally withdrawing from the agreement, has actually presented itself as a state party that cannot really be relied upon even after it has actually signed on a multilateral agreement. So the perception that seems to be is to actually look at the US as an unreliable state actor rather than Iran.
When the United States declared its exit from the JCPOA, it made an announcement that it found this agreement as not being fully in accordance with international law, if you want to go on the legal basis of all what the Iranian government is about. terrorism is not a part of, in accordance with international law. Developing missiles and sending them to another state, non-state actor, another state actor to be used as an aggression against another country is also not in accordance with international law. Now, these are very important aspects. They're not spoken maybe in this context. But again, the United States government has chosen a strategy that it believes will be more successful than sitting on the table and waiting for answers, which have already been discussed many years ago at the beginning of the JCPOA discussions.
Okay.
This is what they were only able to conclude.
Okay. Dr. Reginbogin, stay with me. I'm also joined by Mohammad Marandi, who is an analyst based in Tehran. Mr. Marandi, Dr. Reginbogin just told us that there are other issues of concern, and Iran is not really a reliable partner when it comes to negotiating. And of course, those issues of concern, as you just mentioned, are about Iran's missile development and also the use of proxies. And as he said, quote unquote, terrorist activities in the Middle East. Would you like to respond to that?
When it comes to terrorism and proxies, I'm assuming that your audience knows that the United States has been supporting Al-Qaeda in Syria for years. And through its proxies, they've helped Al-Qaeda, they've helped Ejaz Haider and other extremist groups for years now. And this is, you can see this in the WikiLeaks documents. This is an admission of Hillary Clinton, if you look at her emails. And if your audience would like to check the 2012 National Defense document or the Defense Intelligence Agency document, where at that time General Flynn was in charge, and in that document it stated that the extremists in Syria had the upper hand from almost the beginning, and that U.S. allies were supporting them. And that, and then General Flynn on Al Jazeera admitted that the United States took a willful decision to support these extremists. And
but Mr. Marandi, let me interject here. Similar accusation is leveled against Iran in relation to non-state actors like Hezbollah and Iran's support for Bashar al-Assad's regime, which has chosen to essentially be extremely brutal and oppressive of its own people. So I think this kind of blame can be assigned to all sides in this conflict.
Not really. Hezbollah is not a non-state actor. Hezbollah has ministers in the government, they have MPs in parliament, and their bearing of arms is with the consent of the Lebanese government. And the reason why they have arms is because the Israeli regime has invaded Lebanon repeatedly. On the other hand, the Americans can't have their cake and eat it too. How can Syria and the Syrian government be a non-state actor? The Syrian government is the legitimate government of the land. The Indian government recognizes the UN, and the UN seat is given to the Syrian government. The United States has been supporting extremist groups in Syria like Al-Qaeda, and they continue to do so in the province of Idlib as we speak. So when the United States speaks about terrorism, they are the first and foremost country that are supporting terrorism. When it comes to being reliable, it is Iran that is abiding by its nuclear commitments, not the United States. It is Iran that is, even over the last year, since the Americans withdrew and the Europeans have been in complete violation, the Iranians have been committing themselves 100% according to the International Atomic Energy Agency. And then when it comes to missile defense, the United States has 50 military bases surrounding Iran. And they expect Iran to give up its military defense capabilities. If Iran did not produce its own indigenous surface-to-air missiles, U.S. aircraft would be roaming the Iranian skies as we speak. So the Americans intrude into Iranian airspace with a $200 million drone. The Iranians shoot it down, and then the Americans are outraged. The remains fall into Iranian waters. The Iranians have the evidence. They take it to the UN Security Council, and the Americans declare a closed-door session at the UN Security Council so that the Iranians cannot present their evidence to the people at the table. Why? Because they know that they had intentionally violated Iranian airspace.
Okay, let me quickly go back to Dr. Nakhai before I go to Dr. Reginbogin. Dr. Nakhai, it's very clear from what Dr. Reginbogin is saying that, and as I mentioned earlier also, that the Trump administration is not just looking at the JCPOA, it's looking at what it calls the general Iranian behavior, which refers to Iran's attempt to project power in the Middle East. And obviously, there is the conflict between Iran and US allies in the Middle East. So the American maximum pressure campaign is essentially, it seems, designed to force Iran into changing its behavior, as the US puts it. Do you agree with that assessment?
No, let's look at from a different angle. First, JCPOA was for one purpose, and it served its purpose from the beginning. From even when the talks were on, President Trump, that was in presidential election year, continued to say this is the worst agreement, and I don't agree the worst agreement ever have been signed by the United States. So it is not that it is not against JCPOA, it's everybody in his administrations, the close ones, the hardliners, are and have been against JCPOA. That's number one. Number two, after 4 years of distrust between two nations, once you make an agreement, you look at that as a starting point and try to build on that, rather than break up all the trust that you are built, albeit very narrow trust, then expect to restart it again.
Absolutely.
Next year will be United States presidential election. Let's assume if Iran comes, we shouldn't, but comes to the table and sign an agreement with President Trump. That will not be a UN resolution. Most probably the other members will not come and sign it, but let's assume that they sign. And next president comes around and says, I don't accept it, and tear it up.
No, absolutely. I totally, this is one of the, no, absolutely, you're right, because this is one of the problems with withdrawing unilaterally, because one doesn't really know where the US is going to draw a line. So thank you so much. Dr. Behrad Nakhai was speaking with us. Dr. Reginbogin, I want you a slightly different question here, because you've given your viewpoint with reference to Iran. But tell me, on the one hand, President Trump, as I said in my introduction also, says that I want to get out of these unwanted, costly wars, whether it's Syria or Afghanistan. But at the same time, his actions, or his administration's actions, are likely to create chaos in the Gulf. So how do you square the desire to get out of unwanted wars and actions that could lead the US into another one?
I agree. There's a lack of American leadership. And the entire situation since the Spring Awakening in 2011 has led to proxy wars. There's no doubt that is really the entire confusion or lack of stability in resolving the humanitarian despair of the people in the Middle East. And so I think jointly, if both countries, Iran and America, can look at the humanitarian issues and focus on them for the people and for stability, then may that be a starting point. And then, in addition, why this goes in circles? Well, it goes in circles because there is no really common policy, security architecture, long-term planning to be discussed. The JCPOA is a start, but it was not
Dr. Reginbogin, when you talk about lack of leadership, now here's the thing, if we go back in history, we see that George Bush, essentially before he attacked Iraq, he created an entire narrative, or his administration created this entire narrative about Saddam Hussein having nuclear weapons. We now know that that was not the case. And as many analysts have said, this was something that was created. It was a lie, and that lie was the cover. And of course, the US media went along. Now, in the case of these tankers, for instance, it's very interesting, and I'm sure you've seen this, that the UAE seems to distance itself from US claims, which claims that pin these attacks on Iran. And their foreign minister, Sheikh Abdullah bin Zayed Al Nahyan, he said, and I quote, "Honestly, we can't point the blame at any country because we don't have evidence." And then he says, if there is a country that has the evidence, then I'm convinced that the international community will listen to it. Now, the investigation by the UAE and Norway and Saudi Arabia, they concluded that a state actor was most likely behind the incident in May. No nation was singled out. But the US National Security Advisor is absolutely convinced that Iran is behind these attacks. So there's a certain kind of narrative that is being put out. And that narrative can cause the kind of miscalculation that I was talking about. So it's not just this particular administration. This has been going on for a long time.
This is the long-term problem about sleepwalking. This was the condition that nobody understood, the conditions that led to World War I, as an historical comparison. We do not have a comprehensive understanding nor strategy and implementation with all the parties involved. We need that. That is the reason we have these issues, and they're very short-term. And when it comes to justifying and legitimizing reactions, yes, one says they have the evidence, the other doesn't. It's very simple. Put it in the United Nations Council, open, not closed. Let it be legitimately reviewed with technology, not with just papers and drawings on the board. And that can be verified. But what is going to be then the consequence?
Dr. Reginbogin, thank you, Dr. Reginbogin. I also have to wrap this segment up. But I feel that perhaps someone needs to give Graham Allison's The Securities Trap to the Trump administration. Thank you so much, Dr. Reginbogin, for giving us your insights. And I go back quickly before I wrap up to Mr. Marandi. Mr. Marandi, what is your sense of the space that I was talking about for miscalculation here? Because obviously Iran is also now responding in kind. Iran is taking its own actions, and I'm sure Iran's military plans must have targets in the Gulf in the event that the US launches an attack. But do you think that conventional military capabilities, there's such huge asymmetry that Iran would ultimately be the loser militarily if a war breaks out in the Gulf?
The Iranians have been preparing their defenses for 20 years. They have many cities underneath the shore of the Persian Gulf, the Strait of Hormuz, and the Strait of Oman, because they've been preparing themselves since the Iraq War, because they knew that the United States is untrustworthy. Just like the United States was untrustworthy with the nuclear deal, and just like the United States is bullying independent countries like India not to purchase oil from Iran. The United States considers itself exceptional. It considers itself as having more rights than other countries. It does not even recognize the rights of India or Russia or China. They consider themselves to be the decider, as Bush used to call it. So the Iranians have no option but to defend themselves. And I think the downing of drone was actually a big surprise for the Americans, because the $200 million drone was shot down with an Iranian-made $20,000 missile. Obviously, the United States is much stronger than Iran, but the United States cannot remove its forces in the Pacific and from Europe to Iran. The Chinese it's already being discussed in China that this would be a good time for China to retake Taiwan. The Americans have limited assets, limited power, and the best thing is for the Americans to stop bullying other countries, stop being unreliable, stop waging economic warfare, and start behaving like a normal country.
Okay, thank you so much. That was Mohammed B talking to us and giving us a sense of Iran's options in the event of a shooting war. We'll take a short break, and when we return, we shall discuss reports in the Indian media of Pakistan's support for India's non-permanent seat at the UNSC. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. On Wednesday, the Indian media reported that Pakistan did not object to India's consensus candidature in the Asia-Pacific group for the 2021-22 non-permanent seat. Some reports also gave another false slant to the development by implying that this was a stepping stone to India's quest for a permanent seat at the UNSC. In Pakistan, there was confusion with reference to the development, especially in the absence of any immediate word from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. A few analysts pointed to the fact that this was in keeping with past practice, but there were scant details on the technicalities involved, as also what it entails. To clear the confusion and set the record straight, we have with us Ambassador Tasnim Aslam, former Special Secretary, Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Ambassador Aslam also has experience of how things work at the UN and its various bodies, having served as Additional Secretary, United Nations and European Union. Thank you for being with us, Ambassador Aslam. Just walk us through how this works.
Okay, thank you, Ejaz, for the opportunity to clarify a few points. Elections to various UN bodies is a very technical subject and very complicated one. Countries float their candidates years before the elections, particularly to the important bodies like the UN Security Council and Human Rights Council, ECOSOC, etc. In the same vein, we also floated our candidature some years back for the year 23-24. And have been working with various countries seeking support. So how it works is that once countries announce their candidature to a UN body, then they step up preparations for getting support. They make bilateral reciprocal support arrangements, particularly if there is no clash or there are multiple seats. Then also, if they are part of any regional organization, they go to these organizations and seek their endorsement. As you would have seen that OIC has been endorsing Pakistan's candidature to various UN bodies. ASEAN does that very often. European Union in recent years hasn't had such a good record because multiple countries put forward their candidature for UN Security Council's non-permanent seat. In South Asia, when SAARC foreign minister or summit level meetings were taking place regularly, various countries would bring their candidature to the forum and seek endorsement from the body so that they could also garner the support of all the members and also make sure that no other country put forward their candidature against their own. What has recently happened is that India, as you know, India is contesting UN Security Council election for the year 21-22. Elections will be held next year, but as per tradition and practice, India has been going to various groupings, and in the same vein, they brought their candidature to the Asia-Pacific group as well, of which Pakistan is also a member. And since there was no other candidate from South Asia, India's candidature, being the only one, being a clean slate, was approved or endorsed by acclamation. Obviously, if there is no other candidate, there is no reason why any country would object to it. That makes no sense. Similarly, we did not object. But apart from that, Pakistan and India have been, as normal practice, seeking elections to various UN bodies, and where possible, there have been understandings that if we were contesting for one body, India would not oppose it, at least overtly. We know that when we contested the Human Rights Council election, India launched a massive campaign, recruited many NGOs to work against Pakistan, to undermine Pakistan's candidature. India did not succeed, that's a different matter. But generally, if there is a clean slate, countries don't raise objection. So this is what happened in New York. There was no other candidate, and there was absolutely no legal or political or moral ground for Pakistan to object to India's candidature.
Okay, so please clarify, and people are asking these questions. One, the kind of relations we have with India right now. Of course, in March there was a military round also. There's no dialogue going on, and India has made its hostile intentions rather very clear. So the question people ask is that, is there a precedent that, for instance, in the Asia-Pacific group, if India was the only candidate, that Pakistan could have opposed it? And if Pakistan were to actually oppose it, would that be unprecedented? Would that be something that would have antagonized friendly states? How does that work?
First, I would like to talk a bit about what you mentioned earlier, that the Indian media's claims that it could lead to Pakistan withdrawing its objection to India's permanent membership of the UN Security Council. There are a couple of things there. First, Pakistan, along with a large number of Uniting for Consensus member countries, has a principled position that we are against the expansion in the permanent category, which would create new power centers. We have seen that permanent members only use the Security Council to further their own agendas and interests, and are very hegemonic in their outlook, particularly how the US has behaved on the question of Israeli atrocities or occupation of Palestinian land. Similarly, the membership of the UN is close to 192, but apart from these 5 countries, the other countries have only 10 seats to contest against or to represent various regional groups or their own interests. So the turn of each country comes after a long time. So we are fundamentally, along with a large number of other countries, opposed to the idea of creating new permanent members who would only be out there to further their agendas and their interests and undermine the basic purpose and mandate of the UN Security Council, which is to maintain international peace and security. And in India's case, India is in violation of the UN Security Council resolution. We do not feel that India has the legal, moral authority to claim a place on that table. So there is no question of change in Pakistan's position on that, because we are for democratizing the UN Security Council, for making it more transparent, for making it more representative. So we are in favor of increasing long-term, non-permanent seats number, so that other countries, the large group of countries, membership of the UN organization can more frequently represent their own country and like-minded countries in the UN Security Council and contribute to global peace and security. So I think this is all what has been reported is totally out of place and it has no basis. Posing a clean slate is, I think Pakistan behaves as a rational country. We are a responsible nation and we have always played a very constructive and positive role in the UN. We have never been known for obstructing the UN agenda or working of its various organizations. We are against politicizing the election of various UN bodies as well. So in that, in keeping with that policy, we did not oppose India's candidature, and particularly because there was no other candidate. So there were no reasons, no grounds to oppose. And as a responsible member of the UN, as a responsible country engaging with the international community, we did not oppose it. We went along with the consensus. Because India was the only candidate and their candidature was based on clean slate.
Thank you so much. That was Ambassador Tasnim talking to us and clarifying what the issue was in relation to India's candidature and also explaining that it is completely false to imply that this also means that Pakistan has no objection to India's quest for a permanent seat at the UN Security Council. This is all for today. We shall see you tomorrow. Until then, it's goodbye.